I've called this talk Medio Gringo, which is Spanish for half gringo or half white, because that's what I am. Gringo is not a derogatory term. A gringo is a white person. In Spanish, we might more correctly say mestizo, which is a mixed race person, but mestizo can have negative connotations depending on which country that you're from. I recently discovered that my Spanish-speaking Latina mother was genetically mostly Chinese and Native North American. Who knew? The funny thing about that is, the older my Latina mother got, the more Asian she looked, which is something her Japanese friends used to tease her about all the time. My mom worked in Little Tokyo for years. Conversely, the younger I was, the more Asian I looked. But as I became an adult, I pretty much turned into a clone of my gringo father. My brothers grew up in Northern California with my father's family, but he disappeared out of our lives shortly after I was born. And so we moved to Los Angeles, and I grew up in my mom's Spanish-speaking Latino family in the mostly Asian cities of Alhambra and Monterey Park, California. My older brothers were 10 and 11 years old when our father left, so they knew him really well. But his leaving like that left my mom with just a high school education and no previous work experience at all to support all four of us. We were on food stamps for many years, and a couple of times over those years, some people made really nasty comments like, there's such a thing as not having more children than you can afford. Like living in poverty was a goal that my mom had somehow set and accomplished. Nobody ever asks where the fathers are. It seems to me that poverty is always considered to be the mother's fault. So today, I'm very well aware that with my current appearance and my British last name, that especially with white people, my appearance passes for white. But with Spanish and English as my first languages, and as the son of a single parent who was an impoverished woman of color, the circumstances of my life do not pass for white. And that has certainly affected my ability to get a job in the world of Unitarian Universalism. I want to do a quick experiment. This might fall flat on its face, but I hope that it won't. I'm going to tell you something that I do as a habit, and if you do the same thing or something like it, I'm going to ask that you please stand up or raise your hand high as you're willing and able. So this thing that I do is if I'm out in public, like if I'm sitting in a restaurant, and if a person of color sits near me in the restaurant, I watch everyone else to try to determine if I feel like any of them might be inclined to give the person of color a hard time. And the more obvious it is that that is a person of color, the more carefully I watch everyone else. If you do that or something like that as a habit, could you please stand up or raise your hand high as you're willing and able? Thank you, that's great. So no, keep standing, keep your hands up, keep standing. So if you look around, I want to point out that the majority of people who are standing right now are people of color or have family members who are people of color. Not everyone, but the majority. Thank you, that was really great, thank you very much. And also not a lot of people standing, right? Until very recently, I thought this was a quirky little thing that only I do. I had no idea that this was behavior rooted in my ethnicity. Several weeks ago, this church hosted a caucus for UUs who are people of color. And in our conversations that night, this watching white people in public thing came up as something that most of us do. It was so good. I got so many insights out of that evening. One Asian woman shared that she and her family went into a restaurant in Northern California and they were denied service. And I told everyone about a time when Reverend Jason and I went into a Los Angeles restaurant and we were denied service. If you have trouble imagining how any restaurant, especially in LA, could see Jason and me walk in their doors and would say, get out of here, we don't serve homosexuals. That might be hard to imagine because that's not how that kind of thing actually plays out in the real world. What happened both to us and that Asian woman's family is that in each instance, we were sat at a table and then we were completely ignored for about 45 minutes until we just got fed up and left. And during that time, other people came in, they got their menus, they got their food, and we just kept sitting there. And a couple of times, someone would come over and say, I'm sure someone will be right with you. That's how denial of service actually plays out in the real world. If you also have trouble imagining how we Unitarian Universalists might discriminate against people of color, or how we could even make some people feel unwelcome in our churches, it might be hard to imagine because you may be thinking of things in ways that they don't actually happen. I can tell you that as a person of color, that white people, like my dad's whole side of the family, white folks keep their business offices and their sanctuaries uncomfortably cold for people of color. It is very unwelcoming. What is with the air conditioning? UU churches across this country, the ones that have air conditioning, are so freaking cold. If I can speak for all people of color for 1 second, we like air conditioning, but that freezing cold that seems to appeal to so many white people is a big turnoff. I'm telling you this because it's one of the specific reasons why my mom stopped going to a UU church when I was a little boy. UU lack of diversity was discussed a lot at this year's General Assembly because of an incident several months ago where once again a UU who was a person of color was passed over for a job position in favor of a white person, only this time at a fairly high level in the UUA. There was a big blow up and several people ended up resigning as a result, including our then UUA president. This passing over people of color for jobs, it happens in UU institutions all over the country and at all levels. I am one of the people that this has happened to, repeatedly. I remember one time my husband and I were watching a British period piece about some wealthy people and their household staff. And I realized with a shock as we were talking about the movie over dinner that my husband could analyze it from all perspectives, but that I had watched it entirely from the perspective of the servants. In different states in this country, different groups make up the servant class. In California, the most populous US state, Latinos are the servant class. If you've noticed, for the most part, we are your housekeepers, your gardeners, your janitors, etc. Chicago was one of the first major cities outside of California that I ever visited, and I remember being very surprised that the busboys and the janitors and the garbage men were not Latino. I had never seen that in my real life, only sometimes in movies. No one ever said to me when I was growing up that I was destined to be in domestic service. And in fact, my mom explicitly said to me on repeated occasions, your name is Ingalls and you're a boy, and that means you can pretty much be anything you think you might want to be. She explicitly gave me the verbal support that was unheard of for her in the 1950s as a Latina Catholic girl. And I still fell into that servant class mentality without even realizing it. And of course, my mom's support of me was only ever verbal. Neither one of us had any idea how to help me do more with my life beyond the limits imposed on her as an impoverished woman of color. I'm frankly annoyed by people who see my currently not very dark skin and my British last name, and they wonder if I'm really a person of color. Lots of us, especially many Asians and many Latinos, are not that dark skinned. But the fact remains that people like me cannot seem to get hired in the world of Unitarian Universalism. It was very troubling to me at this year's General Assembly when I realized that for many UUs, the term people of color does not include Asians or Latinos. We are much more invisible and much less valued than I realized. I have an MBA with a finance emphasis, and for the last 8 years, I've been employed simultaneously by both Caltech, which is one of the world's top universities, and NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. In the UU community, I'm married to a UU minister, and I'm part of his church. Our church is the second fastest growing mid-sized UU church in the whole country. And previous to that, I served on the board of a different UU church during a turbulent time of transition. All in the same year, we lost our minister of 13 years, sold our location of 50 years, and purchased and renovated a new larger location. It was a demanding board position. And of course, I've served on numerous committees over the years, and as Paul said, I've been the guest speaker or the guest musician at 21 different UU congregations in multiple states, from Chautauqua, northern New York, to Palm Springs, Southern California. So I've interacted with a wide variety of UUs all over the country. I have never even been able to get so much as an interview for anything UU related to which I have ever applied. Never, not once. If that surprises you, I'm gonna guess you're probably white. And I say that with no malice at all. I was surprised at first, but I've experienced it enough myself, and I've seen it happen to others so many times now, that I've actually come to expect it at this point. In a recent opinion piece, a man named Ernest Owens said that diversity isn't people like me being in the room. Diversity is white people giving up their seats. UUs have for years, over and over again, hired qualified white people instead of qualified people of color. I think that's an important point to highlight. No one is claiming that jobs are going to unqualified people just because they're gringos. From what I've both seen and experienced, it's less about someone looking at my application and saying, oh, he's Latino, we don't want him. It's not like that. It's more about looking at other applications and saying, wow, we like this other applicant so much better. And that other applicant is always white, or at least that's who's ended up getting the jobs in the ones that I've kept track of. There are several ways that this comes to pass in our communities all over the country. One way is that there's definitely an unspoken preference for applicants who are ministers, even when the job is not that of minister. And a good example of that is how many ministers we have working in non-ministerial positions, especially at the UUA. In our nationwide community, the majority of our ministers are white women. So an unspoken preference for applicants who are ministers is automatically a preference for white people. That's not how it's intended, but that's absolutely how it ends up working out. I really believe, and I'm saying this to you as a disabled, that's a long story and a separate sermon, as a disabled, gay, bilingual Latino who cannot so much as get an interview anywhere in the UU community. I really believe that if a highly qualified Asian woman who is not a minister applied for a job in a UU organization and her application was put up against one of our white ministers, the minister would get the job. In fact, that's pretty much exactly what happened at the big blow up at the UUA that led to so many resignations, and that's happened to me personally more than once. If you've never thought of it in that way before, let me throw this at you. If, like me, you prefer to spend your Sunday mornings with groups of people that are often largely composed of humanists and atheists, you also have a preference for white people, even if that's not how you came to prefer them. This is another troubling realization for me at General Assembly this year. My family and many of my friends are people of color who I love spending one-on-one time with, but the groups that I actively seek out at this point in my life are mostly Unitarian Universalists and humanists and Jews, so predominantly white. Another way that discrimination can play out in our communities when we seek to hire someone is that there's also an unspoken preference for applicants who are, for example, third generation UU or fifth generation UU. People are really proud of that. I have heard congregants across this country talk about their ministers and their DREs and their music directors and specifically mention what generation UU those people are. Again, the problem is a preference for anything beyond the first generation UU is automatically a preference for white people. Some UUs who are people of color are not first generation, but a clear majority of us do not have parents and grandparents or more who were Unitarian Universalists. This particular avenue to discrimination is an easy trap to fall into. I have been UU long enough now that some of the children in the RE program of my very first ever UU church, some of those kids are now married young adults, which is weird. If one of them were to apply for a job at my current church, and I were responsible for hiring that position, I can see myself unmindfully giving them an advantage. If you've known the applicant since they were a child, and you're comfortable with them, and they're qualified, why not hire them? Sure, that Latina and that Asian guy, they have great applications, but I don't really know them. I've known this young man and his parents since he was 12. See how that happens? The problem that I have seen is not an open bias against people of color. It's a bias in favor of people who are most likely to be white. It's not necessarily biased to hire someone you know over someone that you don't, especially when you're debating a hypothetical situation. But in the concrete world in which we try to live out our values, many of our church advertisements for open jobs all over the country and all UUA job ads have this declaration: people with disabilities, people of color, Hispanic, Latinx, and LGBTQ candidates are encouraged to apply. As a formal declaration put in writing in official UU job ads, that looks and feels very progressive to white UUs. I want you to know that I have come to see that sentence as a way to make UU organizations look good to ourselves, but it just does not play out when it comes to actually hiring people or even interviewing them. I think part of the problem in how this issue catches so many of us off guard is that it's very easy to point out the many ways that we are so much more egalitarian than other faith communities. Also, huge numbers of us did not grow up UU. We came from other faith communities where we or someone we love had bad experiences. And by comparison, UUs are a shining and brilliant light. When I was a child, for example, there were virtually no women UU ministers at all. And we deliberately and intentionally did something about that. Today, a clear majority of our ministers are women. Most of my Latina family members are part of a religion where women have very few options when it comes to being clergy. So by comparison, UUs look pretty darn good with our majority of women ministers. But there is a critical difference in perception on that particular issue. From a white UU perspective, we look at our majority of women ministers, and a lot of us tend to think of that as diversity. From a Latina, non-UU perspective, what that looks like to my mom and my aunts and my cousins is that we switched out a bunch of white ministers with a bunch of white ministers. To my family, that actually does look like pretty good progress that we think UUs should be proud of. It looks like something we hope other people will admire and try to emulate whenever possible, but it does not look anything like diversity. My mom was so turned off by Unitarian Universalism when I was a boy that I completely missed out on everything about this community until I was 40 and my blue-eyed husband brought me here. And let me tell you, in Latino families, it's the mom who decides where the whole church goes to family, where the whole family goes to church, period, end of discussion. So you really need to appeal to the moms. I recently realized, being an involved part of the UU community, that I frequently make deliberate cultural decisions to comport myself and to speak in deliberately gringo or white ways when I'm around UUs. And I'm starting to wonder if this is why there are not more people of color in Unitarian Universalism. Are those people of color who do not stick around, are they not adjusting themselves to fit in the way that I do? I'm a half-breed, and I'm proud of that. I grew up in two very different families. I didn't know my father, but I knew his family. And my father's gringo family and my mother's Latino family were culturally very different. Someone who is Asian on both sides, or Latino on both sides, for example, does not get a lot of experience when they're growing up, switching ways of behavior depending on which group that they're with. For the most part, I know what is considered strange or outright offensive to both of my ethnicities. There's so much similarity between Latinos and gringos, especially in places like California, that the differences can seem subtle and inconsequential, but they are distinct and important differences. Years ago, I was talking to a gringo friend who was complaining that all of our states in the United States, most of them have statewide populations that are less than 4 or 5 million people. California has 6 million Asians out of a population of 40 million people, but his company could not get any Asian customers for nursing retirement homes that were located in predominantly Asian cities here in Orange and LA counties. So I had to tell him, well, Asians as a stereotype are kind of like Latinos in that regard. You do not put your grandparents in nursing homes. You bring them to come and live with you. And it's not even that a nursing home occurs to you as an option and you think to yourself how terrible and wrong that would be. It doesn't even occur to you as an option in the first place. And if someone suggests it, it's kind of an outrageous thing to hear. I learned a long time ago that when I'm around gringos, not to say things like, you put your grandma in a nursing home? I used to say things like that in my 20s, and the reaction that I got was always either confused or offended. The thing is, when I have not adjusted my behavior to be more white or more gringo around UUs, I've occasionally come in conflict with those same Unitarian Universalists. What I have experienced is that people of color see the differences between us as cultural differences, but often white UUs seem to see the differences in terms of right versus wrong, rude versus polite, appropriate versus inappropriate. And guess which perspective is usually the right, polite, appropriate perspective? As a person of color, I approach the UU community as a religious community. My religion is Unitarian Universalism. And I have met dozens of white people all over the country who go to UU churches, but they've told me really they're atheists or really they're humanists. And I will tell you that that is not the same thing as being a Unitarian Universalist. How many of you have felt at some point this morning that Reverend Jason does these wonderful, uplifting Sunday morning services and Lawrence is kind of a downer in the pulpit? I love you all so much. I did not see that. I mean, I knew that would happen, but I didn't think it would happen as fast as it did. Being married to the minister is not enough to drag my butt out of my bed every Sunday morning. It's all of you that keep me coming back here week after week. And I'm sadly aware that I have outlasted most of the people of color that I've ever attended UU services with over the years. I haven't always gone to the same UU church, but I've always gone to a UU church. And most of the people of color that I'm thinking of, they've all just stopped going altogether. We're wonderful folks, we UUs. I love us. More people, whatever their background, deserve to spend time with us, like my mom and her 10-year-old gay son, who really could have benefited from growing up UU. Being part of the UU community has been life-changing for me, even joining it as late as I did, and I desperately hope that my ability to flip-flop ethnicities is not why I have successfully integrated into our community. But I'm starting to think now that that does play a role. Maybe we need to redefine our ideas of fairness and justice. For example, if you were to use a rubric to score applicants for UU jobs, and you determined ahead of time that to even be considered for a job, an applicant has to score at least 100 on some list of criteria. If most of your applicants score in the 90 to 100 range, but your two finalists that you're trying to decide between are an Asian person who scores 140, way above the average, and a white minister who scores 195, that job should go to the Asian applicant. Some people that I've suggested this to have been kind of taken aback, and most have said something along the lines of, that's not really fair. Whoever scores the highest, that person should win. That's my best to it. This is not about winning, okay? This is about a commitment to diversity, which Unitarian Universalism does not have. In this example that I'm making, when you're trying to decide between a grossly overqualified Asian applicant and a grossly overqualified white applicant, and you hire yet another white person, that is not a commitment to diversity. As I wrap this up, I want to be clear that I believe that our lack of diversity and all over the country is not deliberate. I have never, ever met a Unitarian Universalist anywhere in the country who I even suspected might be a little bit racist. It's not like that. But we do have systems in place, and we do and say things around each other and around visitors that make us more attractive by default to white people. And when you care about strangers the way that UUs care, when you crave justice like so many of us do, when you are truly a part of a loving and progressive community like Unitarian Universalism, it's really hard to see where we're falling short. I think that we can do better than this. And as a disabled, gay, bilingual, Latino, who cannot so much as get an interview anywhere in the world of Unitarian Universalism, I still really believe that we want to do better than that. I don't think I'm being naive. I hope I'm not being naive. I think we're all operating in a system that unintentionally favors white folks. And I hope that by pointing out specific things today, like that unspoken preference for 27th generation UU applicants, and all of you mulling that over, maybe some of you for the first time ever, that can be a step toward something better. It's normal for any person or any group to set things up in ways that make sense to themselves. My mom made what was to her perfectly normal food, but when she married my gringo father, she had to adapt some of her recipes because they were just too darn spicy for the white guy from Missouri that she fell in love with. And my father had to learn that sometimes, instead of getting oatmeal and toast for his breakfast, he was gonna have chorizo and refried beans and tortillas. When different people come together, there is always some degree of adapting and accommodation that has to take place if they're going to stay together. And I just don't see very many UUs making any attempt at adaptation, mostly because they don't see that there's an issue in the first place. A lot of it falls inside the assumptions that so many UUs make, like, don't most people enjoy freezing cold rooms? Or don't most UUs find Christian symbolism offensive? Or this is a good one, don't most UUs have at least a bachelor's degree? I have sent 2 different people to 2 different UU churches who never went back again after so what's your degree in? Where did you go to school? Conversations. It was so awkward. I'm out of time. Yeah, I'm out of time. I could talk for another hour, but I think I should stop. I really believe that my mom would say to you at this point, vayan ahora en paz y que la alegría del amor los rodee donde quieren que vayan. Which, as all of you would have said, that means go now in peace, and may the joy of love surround you everywhere you go.